In Indiana, legislators have taken the control of education funding away from local school boards, particularly the general fund. The general fund is the chunk of cash that pays for instruction, maintenance, and operating schools. The general fund is the heartbeat fund. It pays for the most important elements of teaching our kids. Historically, Indiana schools have been funded with local property taxes. But recently, the legislature removed the Heartbeat Fund from local property taxes and shifted local control to statehouse control. This gave legislators the power to shift and thus cut money from this critical fund that pays for our teachers. What that means is it's difficult to track what is happening with the money that's the backbone which enables our schools to exist. David Hummels and Larry DeBoer, economists at Purdue University, led an analysis of Indiana school funding. Their findings show that despite the rhetoric of Indiana politicians, over the last 10 years, education funding has been reduced dramatically, with the biggest cuts coming to our highest achieving schools.
I want to go back 15 years to 1998. In that year, the average per pupil spending in the state was about $4,700 per kid. I think it's a little easier to think of that in terms of how much money does a single classroom get. So let's take an average classroom, 21, 22 kids. That's right around $100,000 for that classroom. Now, that probably seems like a lot of money, but it pays for a teacher. It pays for any instructional aides, teacher's aides in the classroom. It pays for physical education and music and art and the cafeteria and the library and the school principal and the counselors and any maintenance. Basically, almost everything the school does is going to come out of that $100,000 per classroom. So 1998, $100,000. And over the next 5 years, up through 2002, 2003, the money edged up very slowly. And so by 2002, you were looking at about $107,000 per classroom, just slightly keeping ahead of inflation. At that point, 2002 is really the high water mark for education funding in the state of Indiana. And everything since then has been downhill. So probably the simplest way to think about it is if you just look at the dollar values put into the schools, it looks like the dollar values are slowly moving upwards. $50 this year, $100 next year, that sort of thing per child. But then you have to take into account that costs of running the schools are rising sharply over time. Inflation is eating away the value of those dollars. So inflation is this kind of termite that slowly eats away at the value of the dollars being spent. The energy needed to heat and light the buildings is getting more expensive. Textbook costs are going through the roof. Health insurance premiums more than doubled in that period, and they went from 20 to 30% of personnel costs. Okay, so energy, textbooks, health insurance costs, those are all inflationary costs that are out of control of the schools. There's nothing the school can do really to avoid incurring those costs. So what we have, once you take into account those rising costs, those termites eating away at the value of the dollars. Our classroom that had $100,000 in 1998 and $107,000 in 2002 is down all the way to about $82,000. In 10 years, that's a cut of almost a quarter of the money available to the average classroom to educate those kids. In addition to that, you have, over the last several years, a number of episodes in which there were sharp, unpredicted, and difficult to accommodate cuts. So in the recession, we had a $300 million cut to the schools. And then again the year after that, and again the year after that. And so the accumulated cuts there were nearly $1 billion. But a simple way to think about the impact of those cuts is to ask how much of the state's total income is being devoted to these educational expenses. If we go back to 2002, the high watermark for funding, it was only 2.7% of state's total income in Indiana. Today, it's more like 2.2%. So this has been a conscious political decision to devote less and less of our state's resources to funding education. So how does a school adjust to those kinds of steady, every year cuts in the resources available to teach? So what do? You cut the supply budget. You go from offering PE and music and art 3 days a week down to 2 days a week. You decide, I can't afford to send my teachers to a conference to learn new instructional technology for math and science classrooms. Maybe you used to have a teacher's aide in the classroom who could help with kids who are falling behind with reading and math. Well, you let go of the teacher's aide, so now there's no one to help with that remediation. You let class sizes grow just a little bit. You don't double them in size, you add a few more kids to every classroom. And so every day, each kid gets just a little bit less time from their teacher. And you encourage experienced teachers to retire so that you can replace them with low-cost novice instructors. None of that's a disaster. None of that is anything you could point to and say, my school's terrible now. It's just termites eating at the foundation of educational quality. And as we know, termites can stay down there in the basement for year after year after year, and eventually the building collapses.